Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to have you here today. We're about to explore a fascinating topic, themes 1 through 4, focusing on the East-West divergence and dialogue. The full title is A Cultural, Epistemological, and Historical Overview. Over the course of this presentation, we'll delve into how these two worlds have developed distinctly yet continue to engage with each other. We'll look at their unique perspectives, the historical contexts that shaped them, and the ongoing conversations between East and West. So, let's get started and uncover these intriguing themes together. Now, let's turn our attention to what I'm calling the Western mind schizophrenic split. This theme really gets at the heart of some core contrasts, and surprisingly, some surprising convergences within Western thought. What I mean by that is, historically, the Western mindset has often been caught between two seemingly opposing ideas. On one hand, we value reason, logic, and scientific inquiry. On the other, we have this deep-rooted tradition of faith, intuition, and spiritual understanding. These aren't just separate paths, they've often been seen as fundamentally at odds. And that's where the schizophrenic part comes in, this internal tension or split within our way of thinking. But what's fascinating is that, despite these apparent contradictions, these elements have also influenced each other in profound ways. They've sometimes worked together to create a richer, more nuanced worldview. So, as we explore this slide, think about how these contrasts shape our culture, our philosophy, and even how we approach knowledge today. It's a complex relationship, one that's both divided and interconnected, and understanding it is key to grasping the broader themes of this presentation. So, here we see how McGilchrist's discovery of hemispheric imbalance sheds light on a fascinating aspect of our culture. Essentially, Western culture tends to favor the left hemisphere's analytical mode. We're often encouraged to think in terms of logic, categorization, and detailed analysis. But what happens when we suppress the functions of the right hemisphere, which is more about holistic understanding, intuition, and connection? Well, this suppression leads to an imbalance. This imbalance isn't just a neurological quirk. It influences how we organize our societies and institutions. Modern institutions, whether they're corporate, educational, or governmental, often reflect this split, prioritizing structure, efficiency, and abstract reasoning over more integrative, relational, or intuitive approaches. McGilchrist argues that this bias toward the left hemisphere's way of thinking isn't just a personal trait. It's connected to broader cultural dysfunction. When we lean so heavily on analysis and abstraction, we risk losing sight of the bigger picture, of connection and meaning. This idea ties into the overall theme of our presentation, which is about understanding how our brain's hemispheric tendencies shape not just individual behavior, but the very fabric of our culture. As we look at this slide, what stands out is that Western societies tend to report higher rates of schizophrenia compared to other parts of the world. This isn't just a coincidence. It suggests there might be deeper cultural or environmental factors at play. When I mention fragmented thinking, I'm referring to how some symptoms of schizophrenia, like disorganized thoughts, mirror the societal or cultural disintegration we sometimes observe in these societies. It's almost as if the mental health issues reflect broader systemic stresses. Environmental and cognitive stressors could be influencing these trends. Things like urbanization, social isolation, or even the way modern life is structured might contribute to this increase. Also, the mention of left hemisphere dominance is fascinating. It could either be a reflection of certain cognitive patterns or even play a role in exacerbating symptoms. Overall, what this points to is a kind of systemic psychological imbalance, an imbalance that seems particularly pronounced in Western contexts. It's important because it highlights not just individual health, but how societal factors can impact mental well-being on a larger scale. This connects directly to our overall theme, which is understanding the complex relationship between society, culture, and mental health. Now, let's explore how philosophical dualism actually relates to cognitive dysfunction. Essentially, mind-body dualism encourages us to see the mind and body as separate entities, which can lead to a sense of internal division or even alienation. When we think in terms of strict binaries, like good versus bad or rational versus emotional, it reinforces psychological splits that can make integration within ourselves more difficult. Interestingly, dualistic thinking tends to align with how the left hemisphere of the brain processes information, focusing on logic, analysis, and language. But this can create a kind of internal tension because it often leaves emotion and intuition on the other side, leading to a conflict between reason and emotion. This idea isn't just abstract philosophy. It can actually influence mental health patterns over time. Historical metaphysics, these deeply rooted ways of understanding reality, may shape how we experience and even develop mental health challenges. So, in the context of our broader discussion, understanding this connection helps us see how deeply ingrained ideas about the mind can influence psychological well-being and how we might approach healing or integration. Now, let's explore how fear and power play a crucial role in maintaining this split within ourselves and our cultures. Fear-based control really thrives when minds and societies are divided, creating a kind of fertile ground for manipulation. Hierarchical systems, for example, often exploit the left brain structures of command and order, reinforcing a sense of control and authority. Power, in this context, is often preserved through abstraction and detachment, things that keep the leader or the system at a distance from the reality of individual experience. When ambiguity is repressed, it becomes easier to sustain dominance because uncertainty and complexity threaten the illusion of control. Ultimately, a divided psyche is much easier to manipulate and govern because it discourages integration and wholeness. This dynamic keeps us in a cycle where fear and the desire for power reinforce each other, maintaining the status quo. It's important to recognize these mechanisms if we want to move toward greater understanding and healing. Now, in this slide, we're diving into the historical roots of the divide. We'll explore the key contrasts that have shaped different perspectives over time, but also look at where they have converged. Understanding these foundational differences helps us see why certain debates persist today. It's important to recognize that many of these distinctions are deeply rooted in historical contexts, cultural, political, or social, that have evolved over centuries. At the same time, there are moments of convergence where these perspectives intersect, offering opportunities for dialogue and understanding. Connecting these historical origins to our broader theme allows us to appreciate how past influences continue to shape current debates and, hopefully, inspire ways to bridge gaps moving forward. Now, let's delve into Parmenides' dualistic philosophy, which marked a significant turning point in Western thought. Parmenides introduced a sharp distinction between being and becoming, essentially separating what is from what seems to change or evolve. This split was a radical shift because it emphasized the idea that true reality is static and unchanging, privileging what we can perceive as eternal and unalterable over the dynamic, ever-changing nature of the world around us. This perspective had a profound influence on the rise of Western rationalism and abstract thinking. It encouraged thinkers to focus on logical deduction and timeless truths, often at the expense of earlier Greek perspectives that embraced change and flux as fundamental aspects of reality. In doing so, Parmenides' philosophy laid the groundwork for a more detached, logic-centered approach to understanding existence, one that prioritizes reason and permanence over sensory experience and change. Overall, this shift shaped the way Western philosophy developed, steering it toward abstraction and rational analysis, which continue to influence our thinking today. It's a pivotal moment that helped define the path toward a more structured, logical worldview, though it also meant moving away from the more fluid, dynamic perspectives of earlier Greek thought. Now, let's explore how Greek influence transformed early Christianity. Greek metaphysics, which is essentially the philosophical study of the nature of reality, played a significant role in reshaping Christian theology. It introduced a more abstract way of understanding divine concepts, moving away from a focus on immediate, immanent presence and instead emphasizing a transcendent, or beyond ordinary, perspective. This shift meant that God was increasingly seen as a distant, perfect, and unchangeable being, more about transcendent ideals than about a personal, relational presence. As a result, the dualism between spirit and matter became more pronounced. Spirit was elevated as pure and divine, while matter or the physical world was often viewed as less perfect or even corrupt. This dualism reinforced hierarchical structures within the religious community, where spiritual elites were considered closer to the divine, creating a clear hierarchy. At the same time, this shift tended to suppress the more relational and experiential elements of faith, things like personal connection, community, and direct spiritual experience, making the religion more about doctrine and hierarchy. Connecting this to the overall theme, we see how Greek philosophical ideas significantly influenced Christianity's development, shaping its doctrines and structures in ways that still influence us today. It's a fascinating example of how cultural and philosophical exchanges can deeply impact religious thought and practice. Now, let's delve into how power structures evolved during this period. What's interesting is that power shifted from being based on personal experience or communal wisdom to being rooted in abstract ideals. Instead of relying on what people knew or what their traditions dictated, authority became tied to universal principles that were seen as objective and unchanging. This is where law and order come into play. They emphasized written, static systems that could be consistently applied, rather than fluid or tradition-based practices. These formal systems helped legitimize institutions because they were grounded in these universal principles, which everyone could, in theory, agree upon. Most importantly, this shift meant that hierarchical domination, also known as authority, was justified through what were considered universal or abstract truths, rather than through personal charisma or community consensus. Power became less about local or communal wisdom and more about centralized authority that claimed to embody these universal principles. Ultimately, control moved away from the collective, shared knowledge of communities toward a centralized system of authority. This transition was crucial because it laid the foundation for modern legal and political structures, shaping how power is exercised and justified even today. It's a key piece of the overall story of how societies organized themselves and legitimized authority over time. Now, let's take a moment to explore how Chinese practical philosophy contrasts with Western ideas of legitimacy and authority. In China, legitimacy was deeply tied to moral governance, meaning that rulers had to act ethically and in the best interests of the people to maintain their legitimacy. Unlike the Western notion of an absolute divine right, the mandate of heaven was inherently conditional. If a ruler became corrupt or failed to uphold moral standards, they could lose this divine approval, and their reign could be challenged or even overthrown. This reflects a key difference. In Chinese thought, legitimacy isn't fixed or unchangeable, but depends on ongoing virtue and moral conduct. Confucianism, in particular, emphasizes ethics that are highly context-sensitive. Instead of rigid rules, it advocates for adapting one's actions based on the specific circumstances, promoting harmony and social stability through flexible, morally grounded responses. Furthermore, Chinese philosophy highly values harmony and adaptability. These qualities are seen as essential for maintaining social order and personal virtue. This stands in contrast to certain Western metaphysical ideas that tend to emphasize fixed, rigid structures or absolute truths. Chinese thought generally opposes these rigid constructs, favoring a more fluid, pragmatic approach. So, in essence, Chinese practical philosophy offers a view of legitimacy rooted in moral virtue, flexibility, and harmony, which provides a very different perspective from Western metaphysical frameworks. This contrast underscores how cultural contexts shape our understanding of authority and governance, contributing to the broader theme of diverse philosophical outlooks across civilizations. Now, let's turn our attention to Theme 3, epistemological differences. Here, we're exploring the foundational contrasts and where these perspectives might actually converge. It's really about understanding how different fields or worldviews approach knowledge, what they consider valid, how they justify their beliefs, and where their assumptions might align or diverge. This is crucial because these epistemological foundations influence how we interpret data, how we formulate questions, and ultimately, how we develop solutions. By examining these differences, we can better appreciate the diversity of thought and find common ground, even when our starting points seem worlds apart. As we move through this theme, think about how these foundational differences shape the way different disciplines or cultures approach problems, and how recognizing these can lead to more effective collaboration and innovation. It's about building bridges between contrasting ways of knowing, which is essential for addressing complex, real-world challenges. Let's take a closer look at how Western systems often rely heavily on unprovable axiomatic foundations. Essentially, these are basic assumptions or starting points that are treated as universal truths, even though they might not be directly verifiable. Because of this, our reasoning tends to follow deductive logic, which, while powerful, can lead to a kind of rigidity and abstraction that can disconnect us from real-world experience. This approach often emphasizes objectivity, aiming for impartiality and detachment, but in doing so, it can strip away the context that makes knowledge truly meaningful. We end up prioritizing theoretical consistency over how things actually play out in lived reality. And here's the thing, sometimes empirical reality, what we observe and experience directly, gets overridden by the weight of theory and abstract assumptions. While these foundational principles can give us clarity and structure, they can also limit our understanding and create a disconnect from the complexity of real life. This is an important point because it ties into the overall theme of questioning how our foundational beliefs shape our worldview, and whether they always serve us best in capturing the full scope of human experience. Now, let's explore how Eastern practical reasoning and contextual understanding shape our approach to knowledge and wisdom. In this perspective, knowledge isn't seen as something fixed or absolute. Instead, it arises from our experiences and relationships. We understand that truth is often situational and constantly evolving, meaning what's true in one context might shift in another. This leads us to accept contradiction as part of wisdom. Rather than seeing it as a flaw, we recognize that different perspectives can coexist and contribute to a fuller understanding. Harmony takes precedence over rigid binary oppositions. Rather than dividing ideas into black and white, Eastern thought encourages us to find balance and integration. Judgment, then, is always contextual, tailored to the specific circumstances rather than being based on rigid rules. Overall, this approach emphasizes flexibility, openness, and a deep awareness of the interconnectedness of everything, aligning with the broader theme of embracing complexity and nuance in our understanding of the world. Now, let's explore how Gödel's theorems support a perspective of epistemological humility, especially from an Eastern viewpoint. What Gödel showed us is that no matter how complete or consistent a formal system may seem, there will always be truths within that system that it cannot prove. In other words, no system can prove all of its own truths from within itself. This idea challenges the Western belief in the possibility of creating fully complete and self-sufficient systems of knowledge. It suggests that there are inherent limits to what formal logic and structured systems can achieve. Interestingly, this aligns quite well with Eastern philosophies that emphasize humility and the recognition of limits in our understanding. Instead of trying to grasp everything through rigid logical frameworks, these traditions often value intuitive insight and a more modest approach to knowing. So, what Gödel's theorems highlight is that, despite our best efforts to build perfect systems of knowledge, there will always be boundaries. This reinforces the importance of embracing intuition and experiential understanding as vital complements to formal reasoning. In the bigger picture, it reminds us that humility in our pursuit of knowledge isn't a weakness, but a recognition of the profound complexity of truth itself. Now, let's explore the challenge posed by what I call the fictitious, historical vantage points often found in Western narratives. Many Western stories tend to claim a kind of detached objectivity, as if they are neutral or universally applicable. But in reality, this creates an illusion, you might say a false sense, of neutrality and universality. It can make history seem straightforward and unbiased when, in fact, it often simplifies or even distorts the complex realities of the past. On the other hand, Eastern perspectives tend to ground their understanding of history in lived experience and real-time contexts. They emphasize the importance of engaging with history as it was experienced, rather than trying to detach it from human context. This contrast calls for us to rethink how we approach Western historiography. Instead of accepting these supposedly neutral narratives at face value, we need to recognize their limitations and consider alternative viewpoints. Ultimately, this is part of a broader effort to develop a more nuanced, inclusive way of understanding history that respects different cultural perspectives. It ties into our overall theme of challenging dominant narratives and seeking a richer, more accurate picture of the past. Now, moving on to Theme 4, Colonial Legacy and Cultural Misunderstanding. Here, we're exploring how historical colonial influences have shaped perceptions and interactions, often creating fundamental contrasts between cultures. It's important to understand that these differences are rooted in deeper historical contexts, but at the same time, there are also moments of convergence where cultures have interacted and influenced each other positively. By examining these foundational contrasts, we can better grasp the roots of ongoing misunderstandings, but recognizing areas of convergence helps us see potential pathways for dialogue and cooperation. This theme ties directly into our overall discussion about cultural dynamics, reminding us that history isn't just a backdrop. It's an active force shaping present relationships. Ultimately, understanding these legacies is crucial for fostering more respectful and nuanced intercultural exchanges today. Now, let's look at how the Opium Wars and colonial exploitation impacted China. These events marked a clear display of Western dominance, both through military strength and control of trade routes. Essentially, Western powers used their superior military technology to force China into unfavorable agreements, which severely undermined China's sovereignty and independence. This wasn't just about trade, it was about asserting control over a vast nation. At the same time, Western technological superiority, like advanced ships, weaponry, and communication, became a justification for exploiting China's resources and markets. It created a sense that their dominance was inevitable and justified. However, this period also sparked deep distrust among the Chinese people toward Western powers, feelings that have persisted over the long term. Importantly, these experiences didn't just cause resentment, they also catalyzed resistance. They prompted China to rethink its identity and push for self-redefinition, seeking ways to regain strength and sovereignty. So, these events played a crucial role in shaping modern China's national consciousness and its ongoing efforts to modernize and stand strong on the world stage. Now, let's explore how the West historically viewed the East through the lens of Orientalism. Essentially, the East was often constructed as irrational and exotic, something mysterious and different from Western norms. This portrayal served as a way for Western societies to affirm their own identity and superiority. By framing the East as less rational or civilized, it justified Western actions, including colonization, under the guise of a civilizing mission. It's important to recognize that these narratives often silenced or distorted Eastern voices, making it difficult for authentic perspectives to be heard. Sadly, many of these attitudes haven't completely disappeared. They continue to influence modern narratives and perceptions of the East. Understanding this history helps us see how deeply ingrained these biases are and why challenging them is essential in creating a more equitable and accurate understanding of different cultures today. This theme ties into the broader idea that perceptions shape power dynamics and influence global interactions. Now, let's take a closer look at the important role played by cultural mediators like Paul Muse. These individuals acted as bridges between East and West, fostering understanding through empathy and genuine engagement. Rather than simply translating or interpreting, they sought to really grasp the cultural nuances, resisting the temptation to apply overly simplistic Western interpretations to Asian thought. What's especially notable is how they highlighted the symbolic richness inherent in Asian philosophies and traditions. This wasn't just about surface-level facts. It was about appreciating the depth and complexity of these cultures. By doing so, they also revealed the limitations of Western analytical frameworks, which often falls short when trying to fully capture these intricate systems of meaning. Finally, pioneers like Paul Muse didn't just stop at understanding. They fostered dialogue. They promoted dialogical approaches to cultural exchange, encouraging ongoing conversations rather than one-sided interpretations. This approach is crucial in our broader theme of intercultural understanding, emphasizing that genuine connection comes from mutual respect and a willingness to listen and learn. Now, moving on to slide 21, let's talk about how the legacy of colonial attitudes still shapes our modern relationships. Even today, we see what's called neocolonial dynamics at play in global politics. This basically means that, despite formal independence, some countries are still influenced, sometimes heavily, by former colonial powers through economic, political, or cultural means. At the same time, Western norms, things like individualism, democracy, or specific developmental standards, are often treated as universal truths. But in reality, these are just one set of perspectives, yet they tend to be regarded as the default or right way of doing things everywhere. This assumption can lead to misunderstandings or even dismissing other cultural values. Development aid is another area where this plays out. Often, aid is not just about helping. It can carry ideological baggage, meaning it reflects the values and priorities of the donor countries rather than truly addressing the recipient country's needs. This can perpetuate a sense of dependency or reinforce unequal power dynamics. Media and academia also play a role here. They often reinforce myths of superiority, stories that frame Western nations as more advanced or enlightened, while portraying others as less so. This subtle reinforcement keeps those old colonial attitudes alive, even unconsciously. All of this creates significant power imbalances that make it difficult to establish truly equal and genuine dialogue between nations. When one side feels dominant or superior, honest and respectful communication becomes much harder. So overall, this slide highlights how these lingering colonial attitudes continue to influence our global interactions today. Recognizing this helps us understand the barriers to more equitable and respectful international relations, something we need to be aware of if we're aiming for genuine partnership and progress. Now, let's turn our attention to the contemporary manifestations of the East-West contrast. In today's world, we see these differences playing out across various key dimensions. For example, in terms of cultural values, the West often emphasizes individualism and personal freedom, while the East tends to prioritize community and collective harmony. This fundamental difference influences everything from social behavior to policy making. When we look at economic practices, you'll notice that Western economies tend to focus on innovation, entrepreneurship, and free markets, whereas Eastern economies might place more weight on stability, long-term planning, and state involvement. These approaches shape how countries respond to global challenges and opportunities. In terms of governance, Western democracies emphasize political rights and individual liberties, contrasting with many Eastern systems that may prioritize social stability and hierarchical structures. These differences impact how policies are formulated and how citizens engage with their governments. So, in essence, these key dimensions, culture, economy, and governance, highlight the ongoing dynamic contrast between East and West in our contemporary world. Recognizing these distinctions helps us better understand global interactions and the diversity of approaches in addressing shared issues. This theme ties back to our overall exploration of how historical differences continue to influence today's global landscape. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide.